Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of the Tuesday Show. The Tuesday Show is usually a general review of news emanating from or relevant to East London, but tonight we're having a special programme and we're looking again at the case of Julian Assange, who will not be extradited to the USA, the court has ruled, but who still appears, strangely, to be being held in prison. And we have three wonderful guests joining us who all can contribute very special knowledge about the Julian Assange case and about the kind of world we're living in. So if you have any questions for them, ring in. You know the number, 0208 12345 07. So if you're watching us live, you're very welcome to call in. And now I'm just going to introduce two of our guests who are with us. The third will be joining us a little later. So welcome to the Tuesday Show to Deepa Driver, who is a lecturer and an activist. Of course, we're all activists, and who was the Haldane Society's representative at the recent hearings of the extradition case. And Deepa is that position gave her access to the hearings, but of course she is speaking entirely in a personal capacity. She's not here to represent the Haldane Society, but she's still very welcome. And we also have Mohamed Elmaazi, who is very welcome too. And you're a journalist, Mohamed, and in that capacity, you've attended the hearings, and you've reported on them. So hopefully, you've got your facts at your fingertips. And we've heard from Sami Ramadani. He's just running up his stairs to his computer. He should be joining us any moment now. So we'll begin, if we may, Deepa, by coming to you and talking about. Again, most of our viewers will now be aware of the trial and the demonisation of Julian Assange that's going on. But I wonder if you could just give us a couple of minutes of context and just remind us, what did he do that led to this train of events which left him in jail now, or incarcerated for 10 years, for a decade? What did he do? Who is Julian Assange?
Thanks, Jenny, and thank you very much for having me on your show. I'd like to start by talking about the case of a German citizen of Lebanese descent by the name of Khaled Elmaazi. Khaled Elmaazi was on holiday on the Macedonian border when he was abducted from a tourist bus by CIA agents. He was then tortured, sodomized, imprisoned in a CIA black site for several months, at which point they realized it was a case of mistaken identity. But they didn't release him. Instead, they continued to torture him while the CIA continued its internal wranglings on whether to release Mr. Elmaazi or not. He was finally released in Albania, and when he was released there, sorry, there's a bit of disturbance. When he was released there, he wasn't sure if he was going to be shot in the back of the head. And the Albanian authorities picked him up, sent him back to Germany, at which point nobody would believe his story. And until the WikiLeaks releases came along, what happened to Elmaazi was kind of hidden. There was a journalist by the name of John Gertz who compared flight logs and tried to explain what had happened to Mr. Elmaazi by showing the flight paths of certain CIA operatives, etc., using the WikiLeaks data, using other data. But what was most powerful was finding out that all this while Mr. Elmaazi's case went to the European Court of Human Rights, and he relied on WikiLeaks information to be able to prove his position and get some kind of restitution for the horrors that had been inflicted upon him. But also what came to light was that the Americans had put pressure on the German government not to take action against the 13 CIA agents who had been involved in Mr. Elmaazi's rendition and torture. So had it not been for WikiLeaks, serious crimes such as these would never have come to light. And it is because of what the Americans and their allies did in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other parts of the world, particularly what they've done also in Guantanamo And also information about things like, Trafigura dumping waste alongside the Ivory Coast. These are the kinds of things that WikiLeaks revealed. And it is as a result of this that Julian Assange today sits in Belmarsh prison, even though a British court, a British judge has ruled that the bar to extradition, which is that he has a suicide risk, applies, and therefore he should not be extradited. Yet in the interest of supposed fair play, and the Americans are appealing, he is being denied his basic human rights. And what I wanted to point out to your viewers that this Friday marks 5 years since the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found that Britain and Sweden have been illegally and arbitrarily detaining Mr. Assange. And it is now 10 years since Julian has been a free man. And even now, Britain is not living up to any of its duties under international law. In fact, it's progressively or rather regressively eroding them.
That's a terrible story, and we really must underline that nobody must think, oh, it's a distant case, it can't happen to me, because probably the gentleman of whom you spoke thought he was just going on holiday and it couldn't happen to him either. And even, dear viewer, if you think it couldn't happen to you, you're paying for it. It's your taxpayers' money that's going to support the government in its attempt to do this. We welcome now Sami Ramadani, who's been able to join us. So you're very welcome, Sami. He's a lecturer and also a campaigner. And Deepa's just told us about some serious information horrific information that was released thanks to WikiLeaks, and people were able to hold their governments a little bit to account, although the processes were difficult. And I believe you have some insight as well into what WikiLeaks released by way of information that helped us understand the war on Iran, or the invasion of Iran, the attacks on Iran, or Iraq, rather.
Iraq, yeah.
I'm so sorry, on Iraq. And I wonder if you could perhaps also say what you think the highlights, or the highlights of the lowlights, I suppose, of that. What did we find out about that war that we needed to know through WikiLeaks?
Well, WikiLeaks played a major role in exposing US-led war crimes in Iraq. Iraqis were obviously pointing out a whole catalog of crimes that the US occupation forces were committing since the invasion and occupation of the country in 2003. March 2003. But Western media would pay very little attention to the cries of the Iraqi people. There were a number of factors why these crimes became known worldwide. One of those major factors was WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks did not only expose those crimes, but documented those crimes as written documents leaked out from the Iraqi, from within Iraq, through Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning passed on the secret documents and films and so on to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks published them. The documents themselves, the written documents, contained a number of expositions of the crimes that the US occupation forces were committing against civilians in Iraq, and also a film footage of the murder of civilians and journalists. And that film shook the world in a sense, because not only the US helicopters were gunning down the Reuters journalists and the civilians with them, but the command center communicating with the helicopter and commanding them to shoot were actually laughing and joking about it and enjoying the kill. That footage actually was very, very shocking. I remember I used to lecture at the university at the time, and I showed it to my students, and the reaction was quite incredible. And you could see anybody who's seen that footage. It graphically showed, although the number of dead is insignificant compared to the million or so Iraqis that died, but it was on film and with US officers, commanders, and soldiers actually being commanded to shoot at the civilians. This has happened, obviously, very frequently in Iraq. So that was a major contribution to exposing US war crimes. And Assange today is at Belmarsh prison. I think he is being tortured. It does amount to torture, his conditions of jail, as the United Nations testified. I hope I'm not repeating what our other guests have said, but yes, the United Nations have affirmed, the human rights rapporteur of the UN has twice now confirmed that his imprisonment conditions amount to torture. So that was a major event for the Iraqi people. And in a sense, the Iraqi people owe Assange a debt of gratitude because their cries were heard across the world. What they were saying about US crimes could be shown on the screen. There was another incident as well, which also helped, which was also US soldiers. So just like Chelsea Manning, who was a US Army personnel exposing the crime, some US soldiers who participated in the torture of Iraqis at Abu Ghraib prison, torture of men, women, children, it was horrific, torture to death.
God, yeah.
And those pictures and videos were actually posted by US soldiers and officers who were participating in the torture. So they were posting them to boast about them. Because Iraqis were saying, look, the US forces are torturing our sons and daughters in jail. Nobody would report it or believe it. But once US soldiers started posting those horrific pictures, then the world started also, obviously, the Western media could no longer hide them. So to stress what Assange has done, Assange, in effect, as a journalist and a publisher, was doing his duty as a conscientious journalist and publisher who wants to speak to power.
Let's come to that angle now with Mohamed. I mean, you remind us of those dreadful photos of people being tortured was it Abu Ghraib, did you say?
Yeah, Abu Ghraib, yeah.
And I certainly remember those being circulated at the time. I mean, we're as a channel, we're based in Tower Hamlets, which generally had a lot of opposition to the war and the attacks within it. And one was continually bombarded by those things at the time, and they stay with you. Because as soon as you said Abu Ghraib, I could just see the pictures. Again, I haven't thought of them for years, but you're right. So we were painting the picture of someone who's very brave and standing up for justice and really has paid the price. Mohamed, what do you think about, you've looked at the hearings, the extradition hearings. What do you think about the price that Julian Assange has paid?
Well, so it's already been outlined, some of the examples of material that was published. Just for listeners or viewers who might not be aware, the charges against Assange, which are filed in the United States, all relate to his role, or almost entirely relate to his role in obtaining and publishing documents that are collectively known as the Afghan diaries, the Iraq war logs, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, and US diplomatic cables. And the time period in question is almost entirely between 2009 and 2011. So that's the time period in terms of the obtaining of the documents and publishing the documents. And we already heard some examples of the types of information in those documents. In the judge's decision, the judge essentially accepted almost the entirety of the prosecution's arguments. The only reason she refused extradition, as Deepa noted, is because she felt that there was a substantial risk that Julian Assange either committing suicide or attempting suicide. I mean, the focus was on committing suicide. Were he to be extradited and subjected to the conditions that she accepted, he would almost certainly be subjected to both pre-trial and post-trial if he was convicted. But so in a sense, that is certainly a victory for the family, although of course the US government are appealing now that part of the judgment to the High Court. But it's worth noting that as I said, Judge Vanessa Bracer accepted all the other arguments by the prosecution. And in other words, if it wasn't for the health considerations and substantial risk of suicide, she would have extradited him. And specifically, she concluded that his conduct in obtaining the documents given to him by Chelsea Manning and publishing them went beyond that of what she called a responsible journalist. And if proven, his actions should not be protected by the right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press, which are themselves not absolute rights, because these are national security documents or national defense documents. His alleged actions put the lives of US government sources and informants at risk, although it was accepted that no actual evidence has been provided to prove that anybody has actually been killed as a result of any of the information that was published, or tortured, for example. Assange could potentially raise arguments that his disclosures cause no harm at trial, she said. She also said that the alleged surveillance of his lawyer-client conversations was either unproven or immaterial, because it did come out from two whistleblowers that the embassy and the conversations with his lawyers and conversations with other people were being spied upon. They're being recorded inside the embassy, inside the women's bathroom, throughout the entirety of the embassy, so that there was a full sort of spectrum surveillance. And she also said that she found no evidence that the prosecution was politically motivated. So, we could go into at least some of those into more detail, but this, you asked about the price that is paid. Well, it's already been described. So that's about 7 years plus in the Ecuadorian embassy, which the UN Working Group declared was a form of arbitrary detention, in essence that he was coerced or compelled into the embassy because of the surrounding circumstances and behavior of Sweden, Britain, and the United States, as well as was also noted, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the UN torture expert Melzer, and two other independent experts in examining torture victims, each individually and separately examined Julian Assange, and each individually and separately concluded that he showed clear signs of symptoms of psychological torture. So that's about 2 years then in Belmarsh prison. And the reason he remains in Belmarsh is because the US government is appealing, and the judge says because he has a previous conviction for absconding while on bail, that's when he sought and obtained asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, that she could not trust that he wouldn't try to flee again, despite the change in circumstances.
So that's quite a price paid for. It's only very determined people who can stand to pay that price, isn't it? To stick to their convictions so much. But again, I suppose when you think of all the people who have suffered at the hands of the governments he's exposing the actions of, I suppose it's quite proportionate. Sami, you're an activist, and I know you're involved with the Stop the War Coalition. In terms of the information that came out, I mean, in your opinion, do you think that information shortened the war? Do you think it made the governments hold back? Do you think it perhaps stopped them going further? Because I know they were looking at an attack on, I think I'm right in saying Iran this time, aren't I? That's come up before as well. I mean, what do you think is the world effect of these leaks being out there?
I think alerting world public opinion to crimes committed by major powers does have an influence on the decisions of these powers. This has been proven historically time and again, whether it was the Vietnam War or supporting apartheid in South Africa. One could bring numerous examples where the actions taken by people across the world against injustice does have an impact and does have an influence. Whether it actually, and by how long did it shorten the massive presence of US-led occupation forces in Iraq, is difficult to tell, but certainly both because the Iraqi people were resisting the occupation and the occupation's veil of secrecy over its crimes were shattered with the help of Iraqi journalists, people screaming loud, and with the help of people like Assange across the world. And Assange, if you like, as an individual and an organization called WikiLeaks, played a major role in alerting the world public to the nature of the crimes that were happening in Iraq. And the fact that he is prepared to go to jail and suffer torture and denied to be with his children, partner and children. I mean, his treatment is horrific. And it's perhaps an indicator as to what the US-led forces in Iraq and elsewhere, wherever there are occupations and torture and killings, are prepared to do to somebody so famous, so well known, let alone what they would do to people who are not so known.
Well, we just heard the case of the activists returning to Russia, haven't we? And you know, that seems to us, we're saying, oh, you know, somebody really being put into jail for political reasons. That's terrible. What a terrible country. And
it's ironic, actually. He's been put in jail for jumping bail. And Assange and the BBC would report these things without pointing out the irony that they have somebody here in London at Belmarsh prison being tortured according to the United Nations rapporteur on torture. He himself said this guy is being tortured. And for what? For jumping bail. And he served his sentence for jumping bail. 10 months, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Mohammed might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. 10 months was the jail sentence for jumping bail. So he's in jail for nothing. There are no charges against him. There is an outstanding request by the United States to extradite him. Why can't he be out while the courts are hearing all this? So yes, there is a lot of hypocrisy with the mainstream media. But
Deepa, what do you?
He's a brave man.
Yeah, Deepa, what do you think? What does the Haldane Society think about this? What happened to habeas corpus? I thought we were okay in Britain.
Actually, Jenny, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a step back and answer the question you asked at the start, because it wasn't just the courage of Julian Assange that has caused him to be in prison. It's also the example that he has set to others and the enablement of whistleblowers and journalists that has caused them to be where he is. Now, Assange was very unique in that most modern journalism hadn't kept pace with the fact that the electronic age had come in. And when Assange created this platform where whistleblowers could dump 20,000, 30,000 records and provide it securely to journalists in a way in which there was the whistleblower's identity protected, but also the quality of the documentation protected. And that information would be archived, which meant that when something was declassified, you could look at it against the information and find out what's really going on. That really scared those in positions of power who have been very used to not being accountable. And it is that fear that causes them now to stamp down on the one person who has created a platform which can allow allow the information that whistleblowers, because you and I don't know what's really going on inside government or inside opaque corporations, and it's only people on the inside who can let us know. And when they were rectally force-feeding peanuts to people at Guantanamo, causing internal organ damage, we didn't know about it. It's only because Assange and Chelsea Manning had both courage and the technical capability to be able to share that information with the world in a secure way, such that to this date, unlike every other news media organization, WikiLeaks has a 100% accuracy record. That clear evidence, and Patrick Coburn, the famous journalist, said he knew what was going on in Iraq, but he didn't have the evidence to be able to put it in. The mainstream media is an oligarchic kind of oligopolistic kind of structure, which means that only a certain number of voices can be heard, and you can only be accepted in the mainstream media if you fall within that range of opinion. And what Assange and WikiLeaks did was to change that, to break that, which meant that you could have information going to local players in Tunisia, which would be relevant to them in the Arab Spring. And you could also have national issues, or international issues, which might be taken up by the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian, who have, of course, all abandoned Assange in his hour of need, but are slowly coming back, of course. But coming back to your question about what rights do they have to detain Assange at this stage? Of course, the judge at the magistrate's court is the one who is able to grant bail or deny it, and she has denied it. Now, I think Mohamed made very clear that this denial of bail has not taken into account the fact that at the time when Julian Assange was persecuted for seeking asylum, nobody knew the information, or maybe some people in the government and establishment, of course, knew, but most of the ordinary people outside didn't know that all this while the US government had been plotting to kill him, or not the US government, the US state, or to work with Sweden like it had done with 2 other citizens who had been taken out from Sweden and rendited to the US. So that's what they were planning to do to Assange. So he should never have been targeted for bail jumping in the first place. When you seek asylum, you don't jump bail. And there are good reasons for not presenting yourself if your life is in danger, which his life clearly was. But now at this stage, I think there is a case to be fought, which the judge seems to be very keen to be doing the right thing by the other side, which is to allow them the right to torture Assange should they so wish. And that's why he remains in Belmarsh prison, not within the purview anymore of the magistrates' court, but now within the purview of the High Court, where he will, where the appeal from the United States will be heard, where they will no doubt try to say that either the prison conditions, these horrendous maximum security prison conditions where you're locked down 22 hours a day, are humane, which they've already said several times, or that Julian is no longer a suicide risk. And now either of these things will result in potentially being extradited to the US. And this is a charade. This is a game that is being played. And what the game is being played to cut down that example as it stands, and to prevent anyone from revealing what's really going on behind closed doors to ordinary people.
I mean, that's sort of interesting, showing the extent to which, in reality, governments are lawless. We can't hold them to account because they don't observe the law. I mean, it seems to be what you're suggesting. So I was going to put to Mohammed, freedom of the press, when the newspapers were all owned by 2-3 old white men sat in London or in the holiday homes in the Bahamas, you could see that the press wasn't free then. But with the advent of the internet and citizen journalism and blogging, have we actually got a free press now? Because actually the truth isn't just in those very few organs. The truth is now all over the internet. So are we perhaps free?
I suppose it depends on how you define freedom. The internet is less free and far more controlled than it was a decade ago, than it was when I was in high school and the World Wide Web was becoming more and more of a thing. I was in high school in the 1990s, and I recall the sort of advent of sort of internet chat rooms and the like. Surveillance was always built into the origins of the internet. If you look at, there's an excellent book called Surveillance Valley by, who is that? Is that Eli Lake? I don't want to get his, that's not Eli, that's, I don't want to get his name wrong. But Surveillance Valley, people can check it out. And basically it looks at the military origins of the internet. And there was a time period where there was a greater degree of freedom, where there was less, shall we say, algorithmic manipulation and favoritism for various sites than there is now. I mean, nowadays you don't know to go to search things via a search engine. It certainly had a quasi-democratizing effect. But at the end of the day, if when you go and you search for things, establishment sources are being prioritized now, actively so, and especially over the last few years, to the point that now announcements by YouTube and Google have admitted this. And I think the pressure came particularly heavy during the Russiagate sort of narrative, the idea that the Russian state was somehow meaningfully involved in influencing the US elections when Donald Trump won, even though there is no real evidence to substantiate that whatsoever. Especially the idea that the United States of all countries would not be able to protect itself or even have meaningful evidence, given the fact that the NSA and GCHQ vacuum up all of the data coming in via mobile phones, internet cables, text messages, phone calls, metadata of hundreds of millions of people.
But does that matter? Because surely if there's data from hundreds of millions of people coming in, they would need hundreds of millions of people to read it.
Not necessarily, no.
Why not? Why not?
Well, it depends what you want to do with it, right? So all you require is a system which is capable of categorizing people's information, and that which is far easier now with computers than it is with human beings, which means that let's say I work at a national security agency or an equivalent that has access, say like a GCHQ. If I want access, I'll say, okay, Mohamed Elmaazi, put it into my own internal Google, right? My own internal search engine. Maybe I'll have a bit more information, a phone number, an email address, a Twitter handle. And it can just provide me with all of the information now backdated that it has vacuumed up over the past year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I'll give you another example. So first of all, that's one of the things that Edward Snowden exposed. And if people haven't seen the documentary Citizen4, they absolutely should. That every phone call you make, every message, every trip you take, every message you make, is being overseen and stored by a system whose reach is essentially limitless, but whose oversight is not. And all that is required is the information just gets stored. And then if for whatever reason somebody decides to look into you because you're opposing a local fracking site, because you're engaged in protest against a law, it could be about weapons and arms, or war, or environmental protections, or civil liberties matters, or privatization of the National Health Service, or whatever it is, then your information is there. It's there that to the point that you don't know as well what you don't know in terms of who's accessing your information. I actually interviewed somebody recently who's a graphic designer, who's English, he's British, and he recently received a notification from Google saying that they had been served with a warrant from the US Department of Justice 2 years earlier for access for his data. But because of a gag order within the warrant, they could not tell him about it. And they also did not tell him what was provided, what the warrant requested. Many months later, he then gets further notification, okay, here's the warrant, but it's redacted a bit. And what it shows is that this is part of the Russiagate investigation, right, that Robert Mueller engaged in. It shows that they requested any and all emails, including deleted ones. It also requested basically any and all information associated with his Google accounts, all of it. So that'll also be traffic history. There'll also be things relating to YouTube, because Google owns YouTube. Very recently, he received another notification from Microsoft saying the same thing, but we don't know yet what was requested. We can only assume. So I found it fascinating that they're requesting even deleted emails. Right, which basically means that if I delete an email, I don't get access to it anymore, but obviously it's being stored somewhere where it can be accessed, so even deleted isn't fully deleted. And there has never been a time period before in history where so much personal information, medical information, psychological information, intimate information, all kinds of information is capable of existing, let alone capable of being obtained by others. We are awash in data.
I think the book you were recommending, the Secret Surveillance Valley, the Secret Military History of the Internet, is by Yasha Levine, or Yasha Levine. I don't know.
Terrible that I said Eli Lake. I hope nobody gives me grief for that. I think he's a neoconservative, actually, Eli Lake. Yasha Levine, you're right.
I've put it on the comments underneath the video so people can consult it if they want. And I'm glad you gave a spirited defence to my probing question there. I actually remember when I was at university, and that must have been just after Margaret Thatcher was elected in the very early 80s, at the turn of the 1980s, and hearing a man whose name I can't remember, but I think it was John, it might have been Batchelor. Anyway, telling us about police surveillance in Nottingham, and he'd managed to obtain, and that's of course well pre the internet, a document that was handed out to young police officers in their training for how to be suspicious of people. And one of the things in it I remember was, be suspicious if you see a woman who is not carrying a handbag. And unfortunately later it then said, be suspicious if you see a woman who is carrying a handbag, because they're not in fashion any longer. I mean, it was just so bizarre. And he told the story of, he'd counted how many, from various bits of information he'd been able to access. He told the story of how many, the capacity for recording telephone calls at GCHQ. I can't remember now the number at all. Over 40 years ago. And then he told us the number of official taps that the Home Secretary had authorised that year, which was like tiny. I mean, it was literally something like 12 to 1,200,000 or something ridiculous. And, it wakes you up. I'm not sure today's young people get as much waking up as we did. I think maybe that the little group of protesters is quite small. I think I'm quite glad I was politically active in the 80s. It was a good decade for it. So okay, we haven't got a free press. We haven't been able to count it. And I think it's interesting as well the way that Facebook and Google, some of the internet platforms are now drawing back a bit. And I think the Biden election has been a watershed as well. And they seem to be showing sort of some strange retrospective political desire for political accountability, strangely. Now they're saying, they were fact checking. They suddenly started. It leaves Trump in office for 4 years, and when do they start saying, perhaps he's talking rubbish? After 4 years of it, it's strange. It's almost like they didn't dare stand up to the president when he was actually in office. Where do we go now? That's the next question to look. We've got ongoing military action. It's not only in Iraq. It's hidden sometimes in terms of military action being threatened against other countries or supported through client states. We've got the law in the hands of Boris Johnson, heaven help us. And we've got, the press and the internet soldiering on, but can you really trust it? So I think that's something we have to look at deeper. Where do you think we go now with the law? Where's the campaign going? What should we be trying to concentrate on to protect our liberties?
I think first and foremost, I think we have to elect politicians who are willing to stand up for us, because unless we have serious political change, nothing is really going to be altered within the system. I think the other, for me as a trade unionist, I think the trade unions hold a great deal of power and for us to take control of the trade union movement by those who are really interested in working for working class people's rights and the rights of those who are vulnerable and those who are oppressed. More generally, I think, sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback, so if on the line, so just more generally, I think we need to think about how we educate our young people and educate ourselves as adults, because most of us don't really understand what's going on in the world. And I think that education, once your eyes have been open, it's difficult to unsee the kinds of things you see. And much of that education comes from us talking to our neighbors, to our friends, and explaining that, for example, when Britain goes overseas and offers overseas aid, or America goes overseas and does some help to a particular region in the world, these overseas aid, this overseas support that we give is not, although it might be delivered by people who have genuine motives, it's not altruistic from the point of view of the state. The state is out there to try and extract either some promises in order to open up your markets for its corporations, or the ability to set one group off against each other by selling weapons. I think the other thing we have to do in addition to education is control our large corporations, because much of the war that goes on in the world is happening because our weapons companies want to sell weapons, and these weapons, and that's what's driving the corruption within government, the lobbying, that in turn sets off a lot of what we see. And so it's a rather convoluted answer, but I think firstly we have to take personal responsibility for ourselves and our contributions in our society, and not just leave it to somebody else. But also we have to make an effort to educate those who, not through any fault of their own, because of the way the media is constructed and the amount of mainstream propaganda that everybody is subjected to, people don't have a chance to really understand what's going on. So when you understand what's going on, it's your duty to share that knowledge with others, is my little 2 pence of what you can do. I don't have all the answers, or indeed any of the answers.
Yes, let's speak up. Julian Assange spoke up, and I think we have to speak up in our own little way. I think that's entirely fair enough. I'm just recovering from having met the first person, one of my work colleagues, I don't know if she's listening tonight, who said to me, "Here, Margaret Thatcher, was she Tory or Labour then?" Which is just something somebody of my age finds. You just ask yourself, how come we've miseducated our younger generation to this level? But there we are.
But isn't that because New Labour is not very different from Thatcher? What you see from Blair and Brown is not very different from what Thatcher did, and what you see today from Keir Starmer is not very different from what Blair did. And so they are either conservatives or or conservative in Labour clothing. And what we really need is an overhaul of the system.
But isn't that in some ways actually going to put us off? I mean, I think you're right. There's a political continuity from Thatcher through Blair through now Keir Starmer, who I think will probably be a temporary phenomenon. But how do you actually upset that? And we know that Jeremy Corbyn didn't personally upset it, but was perhaps a figurehead for an upset that occurred, a rare moment when people's real desire spoke. And look what happened to him. The man was hounded and derided by the very newspapers and shady forces that we're talking about. And also, speaking in East London, we had the same thing happen to Lutfur Rahman, who Eric Pickles said he would send in a small team from Price Waterhouse. I think it was, it may have been NatWest, I'm not sure, Price Waterhouse, I think. And in a month, they would come out of the town hall with evidence that Lutfur Rahman was corrupt. And they were in there for 6 months. They observed, they scrutinised 10 million pieces of paper, and they came out with no evidence that the police could use. And we have to get our heads around that and start thinking, well, they didn't find any evidence because there wasn't any evidence to find. But with those two examples of people who've been so personally vilified, it must be very off-putting to people who are thinking that they might need to stand up and give their two pence, I guess. But we can go further on this. What do you think, Sami? How can we actually? Is it just a flash in the pan, or how can we actually use the WikiLeaks information to stop more wars happening, to stop the ongoing secret military wars, and to stop new military events starting?
To trying to stop wars and injustice, there is no alternative to mass mobilization, mass action, and organization. That's been the history of all change, positive change, progressive change. It has always come about after mass action, mass organization. Sometimes mass action can be spontaneous, but eventually without a degree of organization and direction, then that mass action might be short-lived, or it will not bring the fruits expected of it. So really the struggle is a very protracted struggle. Sometimes you win one step forward, and sometimes you lose. But not taking action, not joining in mass organizations, trade unions, political parties, and so on, means to submit to an unjust status quo. And that is a regressive process that doesn't stop. If we don't demand rights, if we don't organize against war, if we are not active to change the world, then the world retracts, the world retreats. We practically go back to slavery. It's human resistance, human action, resistance against injustice, which has pushed progress forward, history forward. And the question of election of Jeremy Corbyn is but a small example of what mass organization and activism and putting Jeremy Corbyn's program was a modest social reform program. It wasn't a socialist revolution or anything. And even those limited reforms, sensible social reforms, were met with just with that venom. And I think it exposes a weakness in the ruling institutions. The way they reacted to Jeremy Corbyn and his modest program shows serious weakness. So much so now, for example, Starmer's main job now is not to come to power, but to prevent the Labour Party ever falling in the hands or adopt a program which is critical of NATO, or it calls for abolishing nuclear bombs, or spend a bit more on health, or don't take all power from the unions, all very social democratic type reforms. And they want to make sure that the Labour Party would never ever adopt such a program or have persons leading it who might adopt such a program. And my goodness, they're saying that they shouldn't go to war anymore. We should not be following US foreign policy. How can you do that? So I think they are showing weakness, and and they are trying also to inject a degree of defeatism inside us. That look, you tried it, and look what happened to Corbyn or this and that. But that is their game. I think the people are much more aware now. The person who asks you, is this Tory or Labour? I think have in a way shown some political awareness that there isn't much difference. They cannot detect the real difference between them. And I mean, I'm an optimist. Maybe I'm a bit utopian, but I'm always an optimist that with action, with mass movement, with organization, with determination, and with recognition that this is a protracted struggle, things will change. Things will happen.
I think we kind of touched on that a little bit in our very different program last week, when we considered the fact that actually the first Black Lives Matter demonstration in East London was in 2016. Such a long time ago, and it never took off, and it never took off, and it never took off, and then it took off because people kept the faith and kept going. I think as we begin to draw towards the end of our time now, we have to ask each of you the question: what next, or at least Deepa and Mohamed, what next for Assange? Where does the case go now? I know you have a meeting coming up on Friday, and we will display the details of that at the end, or the campaign does. And I've been trying to post it. I may post it after the program finishes, because it's defeating me at the moment. Everything's defeating me technologically today. But Mohamed, what do you think in terms of what's next for Assange? What are the next steps? What's he got in front of him?
Well, for those people who would like to support Stella Morris, which is Assange's partner and mother of his two young children, she has a crowdfunder seeking to raise funds to help with the legal costs of defending against the U.S. government's appeal in the High Court, because even though quite a lot of the legal fees have been offered at reduced rates, and there's been lots of pro bono work, as you can imagine, this is still incredibly expensive, specialized work. If the prosecution succeed in the High Court, then the defense could appeal, Assange's team could appeal potentially to the Supreme Court. If they lose at the Supreme Court, then they could conceivably appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. If the US government fails, then the US government, the prosecution could conceivably also appeal to the Supreme Court. It'll be interesting to see whether or not the defense file another bail application to appeal against the refusal of bail, but they may want to wait to see which way the judge is leaning or at the High Court, because if the circumstances haven't changed, I think they may consider it unlikely for the High Court judge to disagree with the district judge at Westminster Magistrates Court who refused bail. They may be hoping that if the High Court is leaning against accepting the US government's appeal, then they may be more inclined to grant bail. Because even though the circumstances of Julian Assange absconding while on bail are quite unique, he sought and obtained something which is an internationally recognized right, the right of asylum. And Britain recognizes that right, and they have recognized that when people were defecting from the Soviet Union and would end up in the US Embassy, for example, and of course the government at the time saw them as criminals, and the United States and Britain said, no, this is an internationally recognized right. The fact that he now has a positive decision from a judge, you think would weigh in his favor. Because if he, and this was said at the bail hearing, if he were to leave Britain and go somewhere else, the US could then seek to reinitiate the extradition proceedings all over again. But while he's in Britain, he has the protection of this judge's decision that he's a suicide risk if he ends up, spending decades in some U.S. federal hellhole under solitary confinement for God knows how long. So he also has two young children here, which he didn't have before. There also isn't, so the circumstances are quite different. She wasn't persuaded, unfortunately, but a high court judge may be if they find against the prosecution, because now this is getting to quite an amount of time in pre-trial detention. So yeah,
Indeed.
that's where we're at.
Okay, so and Deepa, what about you? Give you the last word of where the campaign's going and what kind of support it's looking for, if that's possible to describe.
Thanks. I am very grateful to comrades at the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, JGC. You had Maxine and Helen on last week, and others who've been doing the grassroots work, and those who are congregating at Piccadilly Circus outside Belmarsh and various places in France and Germany and Switzerland, in other parts of the world, campaigning for Julian's release. So that's, of course, going to carry on, subject to various restrictions coming out as a result of both the COVID virus itself, but also because of the authoritarian turn that many governments are taking in terms of clamping down on dissent at this time. But in terms of the next steps, I think the first thing that we have to do is focus on the injustices that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange exposed and make sure that those are well understood by other people. Secondly, I would urge whistleblowers to continue to blow the whistle on criminality, whether it is state criminality or war crimes or corruption, to continue to do that and to support organizations like WikiLeaks, which choose to have the courage to publish that information. And I would urge journalists to come together to recognize that now what we are saying is that possessing or handling classified information is a crime. This is the death knell to investigative journalism. And investigative journalists need to speak up for Assange, as Serena Tinari, Nikki Hager, and Blas Gaga have done with the 1,600 signatories. So irrespective of where you work, whether you are a doctor, a nurse, if you're a doctor, speak up for Assange and Doctors for Assange. If you're a lawyer or a jurist, speak up for Assange with Lawyers for Assange. Journalists, speak there. If you're an ordinary citizen, campaign, talk to your friends, talk to your community, educate them, because you're one of few people who's listening to shows like this. And it's important that we get the message out and more people know, because if more people are politically conscious, there is a likelihood for change for all of us. And this is not just about Assange. Of course, his family is suffering and he's suffering and his young children don't get to see their father. But it is also about us and about our rights as citizens to know about the crimes that our governments commit with our money in our name, destroying people like us in other parts of the world and here.
Yes.
So that's my...
Lovely. Thank you so much. I think our message is not in our name, and don't think it can't happen to you. I'd like to thank all three guests for coming tonight and giving up your time. And I think we've just scratched the surface of some of the insidious truths behind this case. But I think we have a very clear message that it's up to all of us to stand up and spread the truth about the Julian Assange case, and to be ready to demonstrate or to write letters or to ring people to make our voices heard. I wish it was the only injustice we had going on at the moment, but we must fit it in alongside all the others as well. So can we just, as we say our very final word, can we just thank our three guests? Can we see the poster about the meeting coming up on Friday, where the campaign is going to talk a little bit more in more detail. So thank you to our guests, and we hope we'll see you on a future occasion, following up this story or another one, and maybe even on an occasion when we're showing a happier result. There you are, on an online meeting. I'll find a way of posting that. I'm sorry, I have been trying to do it without disturbing the other guests too much, but I'll try and find a way of putting it up on the comments box, so that if you're viewing this video, you will be able to see it. Oh, yes, of course, there it is. I understand now. So again, thank you to our three guests. We'll see you again. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on. And to our viewers, thanks for watching. And we'll see you again next Tuesday for the next edition of the Tuesday Show. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.